Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us. Today we have a repeat guest that if you're a very thorough listener, I previewed a few months ago. We have Dr. Lisa Sun from Barnard College. Thanks for being willing to come back, Lisa.
Hi, I'm really excited to be here.
So you did a full introduction of yourself last time in terms of what you teach and everything, but maybe you can give just the 2-cent version for our listeners, kind of just about your research background and a couple names of the courses you teach.
Yeah, sure. I teach at Barnard College. I've been there for exactly 20 years now, going on 21, and it's really great. I usually teach cognitive psychology and seminars on metacognition or learning and memory. And actually last semester in the spring, I taught for the first time a kind of a more focused version of metacognition, focusing on imposter phenomenon and hindsight bias. And the reason I kind of tweaked it to focus on that is because I've been really interested in this research in the past few years. And I've been actually interested in it because I am an imposter. I've always wondered about, am I different from others? And the more and more I learn and read about imposterism and talk to others, especially students, even at Barnard and Columbia, everyone feels like an imposter. So this is something that has been on my mind, and we were able to finish one study right before COVID hit. And that's what I actually presented at Psychonomics. So I'm really happy to talk about that today. And in the meantime, over the past year, I've just finished writing my second book in Korean, not in English, in Korean, but it is on imposterism. And it's on imposterism kind of from a slightly different, maybe my own perspective, but it is really geared towards Koreans and maybe Asians and Asian Americans. And, for example, I have a chapter on it, on imposterism and hindsight bias, but I also have a chapter on it on humility and modesty and how there are different kinds of masks that might be different based on culture and based on whether you're a minority or not. And so there's so many different kinds of factors, in imposterism that I've thought about, not only in my research, but in myself and, across different cultures that I'm familiar with. So that's what I've been, that's what has kept me really enthusiastic about my research and writing during the COVID pandemic.
Fantastic. Yes, perfect lead in. Yes, you had sort of hinted at this course in imposter syndrome, but we didn't get to talk about it. So yeah. I really want to dig in here. And can you just maybe start, what is the link between metacognition and imposter syndrome? Because if you would have given me a multiple choice test, I'm not sure that I would have picked metacognition. But you're right. It means that you're not thinking accurately about yourself. So yeah, tell me about this link.
Yeah, I actually think so. Before I got interested in and even really thinking about, the imposter or, what is an imposter? Before that, I started off reading and doing research first on hindsight bias. And the hindsight bias it's pretty well researched, and it's very common across all ages. And it kind of is exacerbated with expertise. And there's a saying in Korean that the frog doesn't know the tadpole. I say in my latest paper on hindsight bias that, and in my book in Korean, that it's not that the frog doesn't know the tadpole, it's that the frog doesn't want to remember their time as a tadpole. So it's kind of like, I knew it all along. I am was born this way. I didn't know it first, but I know it now. And let's just forget about my past and pretend to be a genius. And it's this kind of thinking that drives the hindsight bias, where you want to put on a mask, especially when you are successful. And what I mean by successful is not that you're like this wealthy, famous person. I'm talking about daily success, right? When you're in a class and you're like, oh, I totally understand what the teacher's saying, right? And in that moment, you're like, yeah, I got it. Of course, it might have taken you a few minutes to understand. And even in those few minutes when the teacher might have asked, does anyone need me to explain it again? In that moment, you're not going to be willing to raise your hand and be like, yeah, I don't get it, because you want to seem like you're there and you always have been and you are from moment one. And so this imposterism is more, I think, the feelings of anxiety and being found out that you have hindsight bias, or that you're trying to hide your hindsight. And so, and the research that we did on hindsight bias originally was to show how deceptive it was. So in a very simple experiment, I can explain it very simply, is that we showed people a series of pictures. It was one picture. It was a picture of one item, but it was really unclear. And it slowly got clearer and clearer as you went along. But once they identified it, let's say at picture 10, they're like, yep, I knew it was a bird. Then what we did was we said, okay, here's picture 1 again. Did you know it at this time? And we just went along the same way. And if humans had perfect hindsight, we would say at picture 10, yeah, I knew it then, but not earlier. But what we found is that there was a consistent, just subtle, just like 2 pictures of a hindsight bias, where it's like, yeah, I knew it here. So we're kind of messy with, going back to a time when we were naive or we didn't know the answer. And we're not, jumping to say, yeah, I didn't know it then, right? So there's kind of no, evolutionary benefit to show others that except that, and this is how I now talk about my introductions, or when I write in my introductions, there is a benefit to having hindsight. And the benefit is that when you remember how long it took, and when you remember the mistakes you made, and when you really know your past history, and meaning the entire learning curve, then you're less likely to get frustrated later, right? On a new task, you're less likely to say, oh my God, why don't I know this? And then feel that anxiety of, oh my gosh, I'm not like everyone else. Everyone else seems to understand. And so this is kind of the hindsight bias, I think, is the source of a lot of people's imposter-like feelings of, oh my gosh, I'm not meant, because I'm not, totally with it from the beginning. And so my daily goal as a researcher, but actually as a mother, as a teacher, as a human, is to, when I see people who are very stressed but look perfect. And I know that feeling because like I said before, we're all imposters. And in a sense, we have to be, right? We can't go out and just keep telling everyone how we don't know and how we failed all the time. That doesn't make sense. But the metacognitive part of it is that, do you really know not only who you are, but who you were, right? Do you know, that's kind of, do you remember falling and then getting up and finding solutions, right? That's how you kind of build up that stamina for problem solving later. And in my Korean book, there's a great quote that I put in from the Chronicles of Narnia series, because I've just been reading that with my kids. And in one of the books, the book called The Horse and His Boy, the horse, a talking horse, of course, says to the boy, do you know how to ride? And the boy says, no, I don't. And then he said, well, if you don't know how to ride, do you know how to fall? And the boy's like, yeah, I suppose everybody knows how to fall. And then the horse is like a little impatient and he says, no, I mean, do you know how to fall? Meaning, do you know how to fall? Then get up. Do you know how to fall again? Then get up again. Do you know how to fall again without crying and get up again? So it's kind of this, I mean, it's really wonderful dialogue, because it's the meaning of how important falling is, but it includes the getting up process too. And if we forget, the getting up process, we're going to obviously be embarrassed about the falling process. So and then it leads to whole hindsight. And then it's like, okay, we're all perfect from the beginning. And that's the kind of the accumulation of imposterism, I think, from when we're young until we get older. And I felt the anxiety of, trying to show everyone that, no, I belong here. I'm at Columbia, and yeah, I'm just as, smart as everyone else. And, the research, it kind of is so sad, because you see the research and the data show that, the minorities, first gen students, even I thought a lot about this as an Asian American, when you feel like you don't really belong. So you have to overcompensate, right? If you kind of show yourself as someone who is different or was different, had a different history of getting to that point, it's like you're going to be found out and you're not really legitimately supposed to be there. And then, of course, it leads to other consequences, like not speaking up in class, not going to office hours, not reaching out aggressively to professors and saying, can I do research with you? And it, it goes on. And so I think that's these ideas of, wow, there's so many people, because we're all minorities in a certain way. We're all feel and we're going to be nervous about, oh, am I, just as good as everyone else? Do I deserve being in this place? And then, if we have a little bit of qualms, and we all do, because we've all failed, we've all had learning curves, we've all been slow and naive when we learned. And because we know that, but we don't want to show it, it's everybody's wearing a mask. And then inside, we're just very anxious. And it leads to all these other, insomnia and just being nervous and panic disorder. And there's so many things that are correlated with people who rate high on the imposterism scales. Perfectionism, right? That itself is just so exhausting. And, one of the things that when I read about imposterism, the sad thing is that, one thing that I didn't realize is that people who are high imposters, you think of them as being people who are afraid to fail, but it's not actually only that. It's people also who are afraid to succeed. And that's because when you succeed, you're like, oh, it was just luck. I don't want people to think that I, deserve this because I'm good enough in some way. And because of that, if somebody acknowledges, oh, good job, Lisa, you're like, oh no, now I have to really be perfect. And so the data that I thought were really interesting was when you see people get promoted, when you see people from high school to college, when people go from college to graduate school or a new job, these kinds of new positions where you've actually succeeded, you have higher imposterism and higher kind of wearing of the mask and like, yeah, I deserve this job. And, I have a little scenario in a box in my book where it was like, I was describing my first day going to my office at Barnard, 20 years ago. And it's ridiculous, but I can admit these things because I think it's so important. But the day I couldn't even take the elevator because I was too worried. I wasn't mentally prepared to meet anyone yet and to wear the mask. So I walked slowly up the stairs. It was only 4 flights. And then I went to the chair's office. And of course, you prepare the mask, right? And the mask is everything's great. Right? You're not nervous. You're not worried or, kind of naive about certain things, because then you have a risk of being found out that maybe you're not totally cut out for this role. And so I think I remember even making a joke in front of the chair, as soon as he asked, like, oh, did you go to your office yet? How's everything? Do you need anything? And within a nanosecond, I'm like, no, everything's fine. Right? You kind of go overboard and overcompensate with the everything's fine. And then the sad thing is you'll never get help, right? At any point in your life, because if you're living as an imposter, you have to show that you do it all on your own. You do it perfectly, even and secretly, right? You might be staying up all night, every night, getting everything done perfectly. You might be procrastinating also because you're worried about the success and the failure. And so I think there were so many things and so many instances in my life where I was like, yeah, that I was a perfectionist, but I wanted to show others that I was cool perfectionist, like didn't take much effort. And, and it also a little bit kind of more severe because of the Asian Americanness and trying to fit the model minority of like, yeah, of course I have it all together. Of course I'm responsible. Of course I'm conscientious. And of course I'm, independent. I don't need to ask people or to complain or, so it kind of all goes together with wearing many different masks and you get more accustomed to it, I think. And so there, in my book, I have stories about myself and different instances. And yeah, I was an imposter at this time and how it made me very anxious and also lose relationships, right? Because I would rather not talk to anybody because I could be found out. And so, all of these different ideas and the readings I did on imposterism, starting with the original Clance and Imes and how it's not only a woman thing, right? It's an all gender thing and it's an all age thing. There are data starting with middle school students that I've read. I haven't read anything on elementary school students, but middle school students show that they're imposters and they feel nervous about this gap between how they feel about themselves and how they present themselves. Right? They think, oh, others people think I'm pretty good, but I know that I'm not. And so that seems to, we already know it starts in middle school at least. And, it's like a lifelong thing. And so given all of what I've learned about imposterism, I was really excited to do this experiment that showed more than the kind of hidden anxieties. And, one of the things about metacognition that's always been a struggle in research is that metacognition is secret, actually, right? It's like you make all these judgments, ongoing, momentary, but in the laboratory, it's kind of like, well, okay, learn this. How well do you think you've learned it? But, it's like you make one metacognitive judgment. But that's not actually reality, right? So metacognition is difficult already. And something like hindsight bias is also difficult because you don't know if that, there's a lot of kind of theoretical papers on hindsight bias. Are you really trying to ignore your past or is it really gone? Right? It's like the creeping determinism theory of, well, once you accumulate information, it changes. Your memories change and they're kind of reconsolidated in different ways. So the hindsight bias occurs because we maybe actually can't remember. but of course, that's still hindsight bias, right? You're still going to hurt you in terms of feeling that you knew it from the beginning. And so the one thing that I was always thinking about before running this experiment was that one of the things that was important was it had to be an experiment that's not individual participants, right? They had to be working with at least one other person. And this is because as an imposter, when I was younger, I was, one of the things I was nervous about was group work. In school, the teacher would say, okay, find your partners and you're going to do this project. And it was like, wait, I don't have anyone that I know who would want to be my partner. And so already that comes together with being a minority, maybe not being very popular, not, having people, not interested in being your friend. And being very quiet. That's also the imposterism, right? Like everything's fine. So I remember doing group work and, people will be like, okay, you can be in our group. And so I would be like, thank you, right? And that kind of thank you is like, oh my gosh, yeah, I'm not really worthy of being at the same level as you. So let me now overcompensate and do more of the work. So, what I think of as, for an imposter, what you do is because you feel you're not as good as everyone else, or you're different, or you have just a lot of weaknesses, whether it's a social situation or an intellectual, puzzle that you're doing together. When you feel imposter-like, you're going to say, oh my gosh, I need to really step up and take this responsibility. So of course, in a lot of group work, imposters do most of the work, and of course that, you see this in younger kids. And, there's this kind of stereotype like, oh, of course, the smarter kid's gonna, I want to be with the smart kid because they're going to help me get an A. But I actually don't think it's the smarter kid. And I think that there's no measure of that. I think it's the people who are really nervous about showing that they are legitimately deserving of, getting this work done with you. So I needed to have an experiment where I had participants working with each other on a collaborative task. That's what I wanted. And the kind of main dependent measure that I wanted was, when you succeed on a task together, how much of the applause or the credit do you think you deserve? And for me, most of my life, when I think about imposter situations that I was in as an imposter, it was always like, no, that's okay. I don't need to have that. I don't need to get that. I'm happy sufficiently happy where I am just being in the group, right? It wasn't, even though I did more of the work. And so I wanted to see if there, besides the anxiety that you can't really see and that imposters hide, I wanted to see, are there consequences that you can actually measure and compare? So in this experiment, I had people 2 at a time come in, and these were regular intro psychology students getting credit to do these experiments. So they weren't necessarily friends. They were just signing up for different slots. So they came in together and they sat down and they had a lot of fun. They played Pictionary. It was a Pictionary-like task where they would do 20 trials and they would switch being drawer and guesser. And so we got, lots of data for each the pairs. And the things they had to draw were pretty easy because I wanted to see a lot of successes, like they actually got it done. And, this is a fun task. It's not like oh, this is so hard, or I'm embarrassed, or, it's actually a fun task. So actually whatever data I was going to get, I think it would be pretty much like a kind of, an underestimation of whatever is shown with imposterism. I think in real life, if we get something in this data, it's going to be exacerbated in real life. So what they did was they went through each of these drawings and drew and guessed. And they were like, decorating a tree, kicking a ball, eating noodles, right? They were kind of these verb phrases. And every time they guessed one successfully, then on a paper they had on only their side, so their partner couldn't see, they had to say how many points of 3 that they win for every success together. How many points do you deserve? How do you get from this trial? And how many points would you give your partner? And so you see them doing this, and then they go back to drawing the next trial, and then they do the points. And then it was so interesting because if you look at the pages, and then you go down the column of self and partner, there were a lot of people that went 1, 2, 2, 1, 1, 2, 2, 1. So you could see those are the people who were giving equal credit because they were a pair and collaborating and succeeding and having fun. But in the end, what I found was if I really looked at it, some of the data you see like 3, 0, 0, 3, and it was very different. And after they did this task, then we gave them the Clance imposterism scale, the CIS, and we were able to divide people into high imposters and low imposters. And by the way, in the Clance imposterism scale, there's actually 4 levels of imposterism. If you get like below 40, it means you're not an imposter at all. But anything above 40, you are somewhat of an imposter. And if it's like 50 or above, you're a pretty high imposter. Nobody was below 40. And this is all Barnard and Columbia students. So that was already one thing that was, kind of telling about how serious this is. But then what we did was we took kind of the intermediate as low imposters and then the high as high imposters. When we compared those, the high imposters gave themselves significantly fewer points throughout the 20 trials. So they were equally succeeding, but there was something about this, these data that I was really sad because these are high imposters that are choosing on their own not to get the credit. And here are the intermediate, the lower imposters saying, yeah, we're totally equal. And so, and then when you look deeper into the data, the pairs were mixed groups or, some of them had pairs where they were both high imposters, some were mixed low and high, some were low. If you look across and look at general performance, because some of them they didn't get, the high imposters did better than the low imposters. So if anything, they should have gotten more allocated points to themselves. Interestingly, they also took longer when they drew. So there's something about the perfectionism and maybe trying to draw it correctly or whatever it is. And maybe they felt because they took longer to get the right answer that maybe they weren't doing as well or they didn't deserve the points. And then the final thing, which I thought was really interesting, was we simply asked them, how much responsibility would you say, how much of the responsibility was yours as a drawer or a guesser? And what we found was that the low imposters, there was no difference drawing and guessing. They were like, we're equal in responsibility. Again, highlighting the collaboration of it. Whereas high imposters, when they drew, they thought their responsibility was much higher when they were in the driver's seat. And that, that to me is very much like an imposter. Like you have to take control and you have to get the right answer out of this and do whatever you can. So you feel more responsible, but you don't get the credit. Even though you succeeded, you succeeded because the experimenter was telling them yes or no, right? And there was a stopwatch too. So, when we went through these data, it was kind of like, yeah, I think imposters, not only are they very anxious and they take on this responsibility, but the sad thing, which I think was the new contribution of this, was that there are consequences right? Where when you feel in this kind of, you're a fraud, you're not really maybe as good as what you think this paired team is. Maybe the other person's doing better, or you feel like, ooh, well, I'm not, I have to really show and prove that I'm good enough to be in this pair. And that's the really sad thing. So, of course, this is, of course, a stretch, but, if I'm thinking in the general discussion, right, about why, for example, women have lower salaries when they do equal jobs. And I think it is very simple. It's that we feel like we're not in the in group. We're not in the belonging, and we don't feel like we're at the same level. And so we're not going to go to our boss and say, well, hey, I'm not getting as much as that person, because we're worried that the boss will say, well, tell me what you've done lately. And you could have done a lot, but the fear of being found out that you actually put in effort, you actually worked hard and had a learning curve, that I totally understand. As soon as I got tenure, I was like, that's it. I don't want to be reviewed ever again. I'll work hard and I'll continue to do my research and teach and love it. But I don't need to aim for more because there's a risk of being found out. And so it did take me a long time. And I remember, the provost's office, they email you when you're ready for full professor. You're like, oh, you want to go up this year? And each time I was like, delete, until finally others were like, yeah, Lisa, you should go up for, right, senior professors. But I didn't have the desire because I also had the fear of succeeding and failing. And succeeding in the sense that I might get applause or recognition, and failing in the sense that I didn't really belong here. It was all just luck. And so not only salary, but promotions, just getting help, advice, all of these things are visible consequences. So I think in my psychonomics talk, I called it kind of visible consequences, because I think imposterism is often kind of not ignored, but people don't think of it as like a very serious problem, because most people are succeeding and showing a successful face, a mask of success. And so, if I said to somebody who's not a researcher or didn't really know about this, and I said to someone, yeah, no, I'm really anxious because I feel like I'm not as good as these other people. They're going to be like, what are you talking about, Lisa? What, do you want compliments? Are you fishing for compliments? If they don't understand that you can be very happy, you can be very successful, but if you have this anxiety of being found out or feeling like you're just a fraud, it's going to have actual consequences. I mean, it did in a simple Pictionary task with fake points. They weren't food deprived participants. They were just normal in a laboratory playing this game. And we still found a difference. And so I love these data and I hate these data. And it's a really, it's very personal, because it makes you think about all your failures and then your path to success in different learning tasks, and then how much you've covered up. So now I'm proud to say, I say it often, that no, I don't, I'm so much happier now because I can show all my errors, all my shortcomings and how dumb I am and how slow I am. And that's normal learning. And then it makes me be a better teacher, because I think students, it's like when we teach, we look perfect. And we forget to talk about, no, this takes 2 weeks. You can't write it in a day. You can't understand it in a day. But students, if they think their teachers are perfect, then they feel like, oh my gosh, I have to be perfect too in front of that teacher. So then the mask continues to be worn. And then, of course, the same with children. I say often to parents, like, wow, parents are so perfect. Like, why are we so, like, we do the same, we make the dinner perfectly, we make our beds perfectly, we get the children to school on time perfectly, and we're, everything is so perfect that we don't often show our kids a struggle, learning something new. And actually the reason I love writing these books in Korean is because it's such a struggle. My Korean is bad fluent in terms of like messy fluent, even though it's fluent. My first book, I didn't even know how to type in Korean, and now I type really well, but my kids have seen all that. And so one of the ways in which I, in my personal life, am trying to get rid of these masks in everybody is to role model like a realistic learning curve, right? With all the failures and the slowness and the, I don't know this, or like, maybe I want to give up. But then learning to get up again and say, okay, I'm going to try it again and concentrate. And so I think that's been helpful for me. I don't know. Hopefully it's been helpful to my kids, but I feel like it's just helpful for me as a mom. Like I'm very rarely impatient or frustrated when I see my kids struggling with something, or when they say, I don't want to do it. It's like too painful, or like too, it takes too long. I'll be like, okay, I get it. But I'll then role model my long, slow pain. That's when they learn, right? It's not when I scream at them and say, do it anyway, right? They're not going to, then the mask happens, the perfectionist happens, the anxiety happens. And so I think it's about, imposterism is not about me as a parent or a teacher. It's me first taking off the mask and being very true to myself. That's the metacognitive part. And then showing others, the kind of the true self. And when I'm nervous or when I'm worried about something, I love it now when I say to my daughter, like, I'm really nervous about this talk. And she'll be like, oh, really? And I'll be like, okay, yeah, but I'll try it. And then she'll watch me give a talk. And even she'll know that I was nervous, but I did it, and I didn't die. I didn't, nothing happened. So, just like telling her, I'm on this learning curve where I'm still very uncertain and nervous, and it's not going well. And so being open about that. So, and it's interesting, the cross-cultural nature of it. When I talk in my Korean book, I definitely have places where I say, getting rid of your imposterism is not about blurting out everything about yourself. Not at all. Nobody wants to hear anything about, it's more, I think, just this is, I think, a really important part of metacognition that we don't often think about, and there's not direct data on this. But I think such an important part of metacognition is deciding what to say out loud and what to keep silent, right? But even when you decide to keep it silent, you still need to believe it, right? You can't say, just because I keep it silent, I'm a genius now. Just because I'm not going to say that it was a struggle, I'm a genius now. That's the bias, the metacognitive bias. And so, that's what I do when I teach my students. It's like, you don't have to say everything, right? Even when you're writing a paper, you have to decide what to put in and what to kind of leave for the reader to kind of, get the hint, read between the lines. And that, I think that's what makes good writing and kind of good, role modeling. You don't say to a kid or a student, this is what you say, this is how you do it, this is how, you don't do this. You just kind of role model, and then the kids will learn, oh, I'm going to think about it in my head, right? Silently, but it's real to them. So it's not like they have this hindsight bias or they're forgetting themselves. So there's so many different, I feel like I've talked so much now and said so many things, but there's so many different ways, different factors of imposterism that have been so interesting for me, and they still are. And now I've started with students at Barnard studies on what humility really is, right? This modesty mask, you don't need it. I have students, say to me, if I say you did really well, that was great. Students who say, I'm really not that smart. And it's totally wrong in every way. It's like, okay, they're being humble or modest, but that's, when you're an imposter and you're saying, no, I'm really not that great. You're kind of saying to the listener that, yeah, I just made it by luck, and you're not going to make it like I did. It's kind of like, that's really kind of conceited. I think it's really not me. I think of and this is where metacognition really is like the hero or the heroine of this story. When someone compliments you, I think the easiest way to be humble is to say thank you first, and then say it was difficult. I put in a lot of effort, and then say, here are some things that helped. And once you get to that part of the discussion, now you're giving that other person a chance to be like you, to, get past whatever, if they're going through the same obstacles, right? It's kind of like the person who gets into Harvard, and people are like, oh, where are you going to school? Where'd you get in? And they're like, oh, school in Massachusetts. and that's really conceited, because you're not helping the community in any way. Whereas if a junior came up to you and said, where are you going to college? Like Harvard, right? Oh my gosh, that's great. That's so, you must be really smart, everything. And then you say, thanks. It was really difficult and I was so nervous, but I got in, and this is what I wrote for my college essay. This is how I studied for the AP exams. And, once you have that, there's no more mask, but you're not conceited. You're saying, look, you can do it too, right? And I'll help you, right? And so it's really about, choosing what information to give. And when you can say it was difficult, but I made it, then you're giving other people the information of, I'm not special and lucky, the luckiest person in the world from getting into Harvard. We can all do it. It just takes effort, right? And so let's stop wearing the hindsight mask, right? So there's so many different things I think about. And, the Korean culture, I think, is especially a culture that wears different masks, and not necessarily the genius mask. It's always the humility mask. And it's, there's so much anxiety about, even if you get into college, it's like, oh my God, they know how difficult it was. So it's like an embarrassing thing. And so it's, I'm the frog who never was a tadpole. You show you're perfect. And I think that's, actually where a lot of the anxiety is, even when you see adults, right? And when you see international students here, it is very difficult, because then they also have the minorityness, and maybe they can't speak English perfectly. So if they speak up, they're going to be found out already that they're not the level of American speakers of English. So there's so many reasons that any individual might want to hide themselves. And I love it when, non-native, non-fluent speakers of English in class just raise their hand, and I can barely understand it, but, they say it out loud. And if I don't get it, they say it again in a different way, and then I get it. It's like, the courage. But that's the metacognitive courage, right? Where you see all parts of yourself and you accept it. So that's kind of my whole research and, human agenda these days.
That is a great agenda. I want to thank you so much. I think that there's lots in there. I think especially as this will come out kind of towards the end of the year, a lot for us to reflect on with ourselves and with our classrooms, and maybe where we want to make some space for students to make some adjustments. So thank you so much for your time. It was great to chat with you, and I wish you a successful end of the semester.
Thank you. You too. And maybe I'll come on again in the future because this is fun.
That would be great. Take care.